Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, members, and about 70 people here in this room, which I think is the most we've ever had. Oh, and you're all going to get your picture taken a second time. How about that? Smile. There you go. So, welcome to all of you visitors and residents here and everybody at home as well. Thank you. I want to start off with I won't go into all the details, but we needed technical help tonight. And I especially like to thank Dan Heath from the Rotary Club that meets here. Don Heath, sorry, that meets the Rotary Club that meets here and who runs the electronics for them, who came and was a great help in getting this going this evening. 3 months, May, June, July, 4 months since we last met. And we were resurrecting the idea of noting out members who had died. And of course, this is a longer list than usual. Firstly, most of you, well, all of you who live here will remember Eileen Huberland, who celebrated her 100th birthday, and we welcomed that, who died during the summer. Carol Davey, Helen Huffey. I think our longest serving member, Jack Pike. And Jack, back in the 1970s to 1980s, was instrumental in many, many activities with the Society and in many other things historically through the city. And he will be greatly missed. And the fifth person is one who was not actually a member, but who had a lot to do with our June the 6th Sir John A. Macdonald Memorial Ceremony, and whom a lot of you noted this year, the grave site was just not as neat and tidy as usual. And Craig Bowles apologized for that. Craig is the manager at the cemetery, because it was always looked after by a Parks Canada employee, Kevin Fox. And Kevin was well known in Kingston, I think he's in his 50s, and was taken ill during the year and died late in May. And Parks Canada never got around to replacing him as the person who should tidy up that gravesite. So Kevin was a great help in many, many organizations in the city. He's missed. And for those of you, and a number of you did come up to me and say, the grass isn't quite cut as it usually is it? That's why. So I certainly personally remember Kevin. And that's a lot of members we've missed, a lot of years when you add them up. Do we have any other notices that need to be given? And if not, Duncan, it's all you. Well, not quite all you. For a minute.
Thank you, Peter, and welcome to the first of our fall lectures. Yes, we're back after 4 months, and I notice we're all much better tanned than we were when we departed in May. It's my great pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker, Susan Smith, the editor of Thousand Islands Life and a historian and a heritage expert on the Thousand Islands. Now, I might begin just by noting that the St. Lawrence and the Thousand Islands have always been a kind of mythical attraction for people in Kingston. If you're like me, we love going up there either on a boat or for lunch, and that is an old tradition. In 1936, the Canadian historian Arthur Lower published a really seminal book in Canadian history called The Commercial Empire of the St. Lawrence. And he argued in that book that the St. Lawrence defined the unrolling of Canada. It was an arterial for immigrants to come in, for exports of timber, etc., to go out, and imports to come in to feed this new settler society. He went on to argue that east-west access was at the foundation of Confederation. And it's, of course, remarkable that the man who really put that together, John A. Macdonald, was a resident of Kingston, buried overlooking the St. Lawrence and the beginning of the Thousand Islands. So over the years, the St. Lawrence and the Thousand Islands has become a magnetic spot for Kingstonians. In the 19th century, its economic and social role was joined near the end of the century by a touristic one, as in this age of the Gilded Age, people discovered the islands as a place to go and relax, and that has remained the same. The Grand Trunk on our side and the New York Central fed the largely wealthy people to come up and enjoy the islands. Susan, our speaker in 1993, published a wonderful book on that phenomenon, The First Summer People, which studied the Thousand Islands in evolution right from the indigenous times to the present, from 1650 to 1910. It's a wonderful book, and I believe the cover is being passed around. Now, her enthusiasm was very much lend itself to the formation early in this century of a magazine to celebrate that Thousand Islands heritage. A number of people quite well known to the people in the islands, Paul Mallow, an architectural historian from Syracuse, Ian Corstein, a pilot, photographer, joined together to produce a magazine. And I will just pass around to show you some of the other books involved. You can look at that. That was a great success. And in 2008, they wanted to pass the torch, and they passed it to a very willing Susan Smith, who has been the editor of the magazine since then. And those of you will know that the magazine is not a paper magazine anymore, but it's a vibrant online magazine. Free. You can go to Google and see it. The latest issue has just come out. It's a wonderful thing, and it's largely due to Susan and the wonderful group of people she's got around her. Susan's background was in fundraising, but since 2008, as I said, she's been an editor, an active. She calls herself a production editor, and the production is really lovely. And her effort has been widely acknowledged and awarded. She's been given the Friend of the River Award and the Keeper of the Islands Award. These are things for people who value the heritage of the Thousand Islands. So Susan is here tonight to give us a personal view of the Thousand Islands, and we welcome her. Susan.
Thank you very much. He's my publicist,
Yeah.
obviously. I don't want you to stop. All right. Now, a quick look at the meaning of history and heritage, which is what they wrote when they invited me, reveals that history encompasses names, dates, and places, whereas heritage encompasses the full backstories. So tonight I'm going to have fun, as I will be probably leaving out some of the dates, etc. And I'm going to concentrate on those who I feel gave us both our history and our heritage, and many of them have become what I call my very best friends. We start with Remy de Courcelles. He was the governor of New France, and if you can believe it, he didn't like the islands. He called them a melancholy abode. He said there was nothing agreeable about them other than their multitude. Most of our early history, as you know, involves the printed journals written there centuries by passing voyageurs. And the first hydrographer to name the region was Jean Desaix, and he was ill when he started out, and his crew didn't think that he was going to live, but he did in fact, and he survived, and he gave the name Les Mille Îles. Now, I guess it was hard for him to say 1,864 islands, because that's actually what there are. But I'm very grateful, because the 1,864 Life magazine just doesn't cut it with me. Okay, we'll go to the next. Now, if you've studied the history of Kingston, you already know about Carleton Island. So I'm not going to dwell on that, but it has played a role in my life, as I was one of the presidents of the Thousand Islands Land Trust in Clayton, New York. And we actually are the owners of the fort, helping to preserve it as a heritage site in perpetuity. We have had 3 important articles written in the Thousand Islands life, and each tells more important history. The first was written in 2011 when I interviewed a wonderful man by the name of Doug Pippin. And he said, neither before or after the American Revolution was Fort Haldimand ever occupied by French or American armies. This makes it distinctly the British outpost and an important location for archaeological study. In the late 18th century, the British outpost on Carleton Island was an important connection, and between the cities of Montreal and Quebec and the frontier posts in the Great Lakes farther west, and the diverse activity areas on Carleton Island include an earthen fortification, naval bases, shipyard, and storage depot. And public archaeology at the fortifications and Fort Haldeman was revealed information about the soldiers across access to provisions, living conditions in the barracks, and availability of market goods. Among the principal inhabitants of the cabins were soldiers of the 1st Battalion, 84th Regiment of Foot, or the Royal Highland Immigrants. Now, once our elbows go down, then I would suggest, if you have never been over to Carleton Island, that you call the Land Trust and see if you can go on a tour, but wait until your elbows are down. Now, certainly we need to thank, next one. We need to thank the Simcoes for several important historical and heritage happenings. But it was Lady Simcoe who recorded some of the early drawings of the region. Two are important. One here, when she was and her husband were coming up river for him to take his post in Upper Canada, they stopped for a night in Gananoque, and there was a hotel there, but she described it as being so dirty that she couldn't possibly spend the night. So she had her crew set up a hammock in her boat, and she spent the night in the boat, probably with the mosquitoes. Her boatman did this, but that is a painting of the Gananoque River and Joel Stone's flour mill. And there is a backstory to this one. In 1988, I visited England, and I spent a couple of nights with one of the children my parents had fostered during World War II. When I arrived in Exeter, Margaret asked what I wanted to do. And I tried to find, I said, I want to try to find Walford Chapel. So Margaret drove me to the town hall, and I inquired where the Simcoe Walford Chapel might be. Getting typical British instructions, and you turn at the old oak tree and you go down to this hedge. Yep. But suddenly there was a big Ontario provincial flag flying. Margaret didn't recognize it, but I did. We turned in and wondering why, and sure enough, there was Walford Chapel. It served as the family burial place for Sir John Grave Simcoe, the first Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, and it was donated to the people of Ontario in 1966. The chapel is known as a tiny piece of Canada. It's in England, and it is situated with the proud Canadian flag flying on its grounds. Go to the next one. Okay, Alexander Macomb saw the Thousand Islands several times before he put in a bid to purchase them, all of them. He was born in 1748, and he came to North America with his parents from Northern Ireland. He was a prosperous fur trader, and there is a story of how one night he camped out on Carleton Island, and his canoe and all his possessions were stolen, but he followed the culprits, and he was able to get them back. At that time, the North Shore was being settled, Canada side. So we realized, as did many of the fellow citizens, that it would be prudent to settle the south side too. And once the Oneida land claims were settled, the land went up for sale. In 1790, Macomb moved his family to New York City, and he built a home. You're never going to believe this. That home was actually used by President George Washington and his wife, and it was called the Second White House. Can you believe that? I was amazed. So by then, he had met his two land partners, Daniel McCormick and William Constable, and Macomb made the largest purchase. It was called Canada. They called it actually the 10 Towns. It included land on the river from Messina all the way up to Cape Vincent. And it was interesting that rather than selling lots to individuals, the Americans decided to develop by selling large properties to single people, and then they would sell it to individuals afterwards. Many came from the original towns near Boston and Northeast. But in the end, Macomb lost his fortune through the very first economic depression. and he lost everything. So this is where James Leray and Ben Franklin come into the picture. When Macomb went bankrupt, the task of selling the developed land, next one, yeah. When Macomb went bankrupt, the task of selling the developing land was left to his partners, and they thought that perhaps some of the wealthy French citizens who were being killed by the mobs in France would welcome the opportunity to come to North America and get land. One of the first contacts was with Jacques Leray and his son James, and they were being sympathetic to the American cause on the American Revolution. The family was owed many French francs, so he sent his young son over to see if he could collect. Now, Leray had helped, would you believe it, Benjamin Franklin. When he went to France to see if he could solicit support for the American Revolution, it was Jacques Leray who gave him a home to live in. So young James Leray spent 5 years in the US. He actually taught James Leray how to speak English. James Leray spent 5 years in the US during the time when he was trying to get money back for his father, and he got Congress to agree to pay about half of what he was owed. He married an American wife. He became an American citizen. And there is some wonderful history about this area, but to make it short, James went back to France when he heard that his father was under arrest. And because of their friendship with Ben Franklin, things worked out. Getting back to our history, James Leray had named many of the little towns in the North Country after his family. So we have Alexandria Bay after his son, Alexander. We have Vincent, Cape Vincent, and we have Theresa. And there's a lovely little town called Plessis. Do you have any idea who that was named after? They had a dog named Plessis, truly. Now, he built himself a beautiful mansion in Laraysville, and that is actually on the property, now part of Fort Drum, near Watertown. Okay. Okay, here we go. This is fun. The War of 1812. Now, the next slide, this one, tries to pack the whole war into a few pictures. It would be foolish to think that that would work, but suffice to say, the islands played a very small role in the war. In fact, the first prisoners to be caught in the War of 1812 were 3 invalid soldiers, 2 women, and a single sergeant on Carleton Island. They were all captured. Now, there were battles on Great Lakes, but in reality, the war was not popular in the islands. Why? Because many families had members living on both sides of the river. In fact, one American, his name was David Parrish, he didn't want to have the War of 1812 because he would disrupt his mercantile enterprises. So he decided to, he paid off the Americans and he paid off the British. And he said, we don't want fighting here. And they all agreed. So you don't hear of any real big battles in the Thousand Islands. But the British were smart. They did build a number of these wonderful blockhouses. Thank you. Blockhouses along the river. The one down in Brockville, Gananoque, and so on. And I have a very, can I ask you to hold that for me? I have a very quick little paragraph here. This describes the blockhouse in Gananoque. I'm going to go, it was on July 12th that Major Herritt and I and companies of the Voltigeurs were ordered to Fort George. And on the 26th, I was sent to Gananoque in command of a select detachment made up of the culls of the corps, and the old and the halt, and the incapables and the cripples. In short, an assortment lot of invalids. These words coupled together are contradictory, bizarre, and nonsense, I admit, but such was the one And to cap the joke, my redundant redoubt was dubbed the hospital. In Gananoque, we have a wonderful historian. His name is Paul Scott, and he has done a lot of reenacting of the War of 1812. And when we had the bicentennial a few years ago, Paul was really instrumental in doing a lot. He's also the Rotary Club down there. Historians say that islands should have been discussed as strategy in all the tents, all the war tents, as securing the waterway would have been very prudent. The British bays and channels served as hideouts for contraband, and the British built several blockhouses along the route. Okay, next. Captain William Fitzwilliam Owen. He is my very favorite person that I have ever met while doing my research. We met at Upper Canada Village about 50 years ago. I was a parent monitor on a bus trip with my children from St. George's School in Montreal. I had seen his name before, but I had no idea who he was. However, when I saw his title printed on a chart of 1818 with many of the island names, I suddenly realized that I had found my genuine calling. You see, we had a boat and we would cruise up in the river. We cruised for about 9 years. And all that time, we would stay at Park Islands. And all that time, I would look at the charts. My husband drove the boat, of course, but I was the navigator. And I would say, why would someone name an island Death Dealer or Bloodletter? I mean, why? And I'd go to the gas dock and I'd ask them, and I don't know. And then I'd ask, why does the international boundary zig and zag around the islands? Well, I don't know. So it was Captain Owen that gave me all of the answers. Okay. So I suddenly realized that I'd found my genuine calling, how the names were formed and who named them. Trips to the Canadian archives helped. I would travel from Montreal on the train and spend the day in the Ottawa archives looking at titles and charts. I spent a week even there over Christmas. Owen was appointed to conduct the comprehensive survey of the River St. Lawrence, stretching from Lake Ontario downriver to the Gallup Rapids near Cornwall. At the time of Owen's survey, his brother Edward served as commander, and both were stationed in Kingston, which suggests that they may have worked together. But you know what? I went through every single letter I could ever find. I wanted him to say, I met my bro last night and we had a beer. Nothing like that, ever. So although there are no surviving letters describing their interactions, I was quite sure that there must have been some kind of brotherly love there. Owen's expertise in hydrography began at a young age, and the impact of those informative experiences is evident on the charts he produced. He named several of the islands around Bolt Castle as old friends, and they were all the names of the ships that he had sailed on in those early years. He named several of the islands around Bolt Castle. He also named the ships that he had sailed on. He later, I'm going to share a remarkable chart that I got in Taunton, England, and you're going to have fun seeing some of those. He named the one area the Treasury Islands. That's down near your island, and the Treasury Island, and they were named after the man who actually signed his paycheck. Pretty smart, right? The Lake Fleet was named after the boats that not only sailed in the War of 1812, but all the ones that were used for anything. So they were the gigs and the punts, these little tiny boats. He named after them too. The printed copies that I obtained from the archive was the name of Porter. Now, I'm going to tell you two stories that I always tell. If you've heard it before, I apologize, but I have to tell you this. On the printed chart, and I think we can go to the next slide. He named out Sir Arthur Wellesley. That's Wellesley Island. That was the Duke of Wellington. He named Picton Island after Sir Thomas Picton. He named Sir George Murray and Sir Rowland Hill. if you ever go over the Thousand Island Bridge, you go on Hill Island first before you go over to Wellesley Island. And they were all officers. There were 55 people and islands that he named that were around Wellesley Island that were officers who fought with Wellington in the Peninsular Wars. Now, there's a little side story here that I'm going to tell you. I couldn't quite figure out how the hydrographers would know who to name. And I mean, you know, we're all smart and we all remember a lot of things. But if I asked you, okay, tonight before you go home, would you please write down all the people that you knew in kindergarten and in high school, all the teachers? I mean, you'd say, what? Well, I have a feeling he cheated a little bit. One day when I was in the Montreal Library, I found a magazine. It was called the Gentleman's Magazine. And it would be very much like getting a Time or a Newsweek back in the old days when those were published. And the Gentleman's Magazine had a list of all the people who received special awards from the government, the Knights of whatever, or the something of Bath or whatever, all of these wonderful little awards. And they were just named. And so it would say a date and a name. I believe I found the actual magazine that he would have had in the hydrographer's house in Kingston, where he could actually give it to the naming guy and say, okay, these are the names. And he'd just go through and find them, because I couldn't figure out how else could he do it. And when I found that magazine and I found the date, it was exactly the matching date. I'm quite sure that they would have gotten some of those magazines sent out by Britain to the forces that were in Canada, you know, as a, send along magazines, it'll keep them busy. And it did. So that was kind of fun. So on the printed charts that I obtained from the archives was the name Porter in the Admiralty Islands. There it is right there. I have a little arrow. This is the group that we live in off of Gananoque. I knew most of the names of the commemorated were part of the Admiralty office, not just the admirals, but also the map makers and the hydrographers in the office. But who the heck was Porter? I spent hours and years searching for books about the Admiralty and the War of 1812. Nothing worked. And then in 1988, I went to England and visited the hydrographic archives in Taunton. I spent the first day asking for the Owen charts and getting blank stares. And then on the second day, I attended a lecture, and the speaker took a book from the shelf, literally dusty, you know, poof, and said that it was the first charts to be published by the British Admiralty were listed in that book. And I knew from, I don't know where, that our charts of the Owen charts were actually the very first ones ever actually printed. So I knew they'd be in that book, and sure enough, there they were. But it didn't say Owen charts, it said Bayfield chart, because Henry Bayfield was the surveyor who took over from Owen when he went back to England in 1817. I was given the chart and room to see it in and wearing gloves, but the man who carried the, I was able to see right there and there, the pencil mark that said the Porter, not just Porter. And so I realized that it was the man who carried the charts from one office to another, because we had heard he was the hydrographer. He was a very famous one. We had Walker. They were the two, Walkers were the ones that were actually the engravers that actually engraved the brass charts. So there it was. Well, in true British fashion, before that week was out, I found a book in Britain that had all the names of all the people that had worked in the Admiralty office. And the porter at that time was James Newbegin. So if you ever are out sailing and you go to Aubrey Island, okay, you can forget the word Aubrey. That's the name that the park gave it. But you can think this was the porter. This is actually James Newbegin's Island. And that's much more fun. Now, the second story involves the islands downriver called the Amateurs. And I looked all over for officers in the War of 1812, the Peninsular Wars, but nothing matched. One day I found a painting in the archives. It was of two Indigenous chiefs, and the artist was a man by the name of Jeb. hey, we have an island with that name. So I asked the curator if she had any information about the artist. And she said, yes, of course, we have names of information on all the artists. So she brought it out to me, and I discovered that his name was Jeb. And then in his biography, it said he was a British Royal Engineer. Now, the Royal Engineers, with many of the same names, suddenly all appeared. I could look them up. They were the same people that surveyed Prescott, surveyed downriver, but they all surveyed on the land. They weren't out on the water. So they weren't the naval surveyors. They were the army surveyors. And thus they were named the amateurs. Yep, it's true. And I'm still laughing, actually. My grandson is in the Canadian Air Force, and the poor guy is stationed with the amateurs in Petawawa, the Canadian Army. Now, another favorite story, one more. There's only one more of these. About the Owen charts was the island named Barnard. It's located right off the town of Clayton. There's a little bridge. And today it's named Washington Island. It was probably named after Sir Andrew Francis Barnard, and he had a distinguished career in the British Army. He fought with Wellington against Napoleon in 1813, and he became commander of 6 companies and the commander of the British Light Brigade. As leader of the Light Brigade, he needed to be stern and command respect from his foot soldiers. And when he died in 1855, the prisoners or the ordinary soldiers who had served with him went to his home and asked if they could see the coffin. It was an unusual request, but the family agreed. And when the men left, the family returned and went in the room, and they discovered that the coffin had been covered completely in laurel leaves. Each man had bought a leaf. It says unobserved, a tribute to their former commander. Now, what do you think my chances are of getting the USA to change the name from Washington Island to Barnard? Yeah, that's what I thought too. All right, one more. Now, the next chapter after Captain Owen's charts was to complete the need to settle the official boundary between Canada and the United States. Now, when the Treaty of Ghent was signed after the War of 1812, both sides expressed doubt as to where the boundary should be. It was meant to be drawn down the middle of the said lakes and rivers. Finally, after some false starts, Joseph Delafield was appointed assistant to the American agent. And we are interested in that survey through the Thousand Islands. David Thompson was appointed the Astronomer Royal, and he was the one who looked after the Canadian side. By the time they got to the Thousand Islands, originally, they didn't trust each other. So the Canadian or the British would do one set of charts, and the Americans would do the same set of charts, and then they go back and argue about it. But it was pretty easy because it was really a straight line down the St. Lawrence River or down along the parallel. So that wasn't so difficult. But when they got to the islands, it was very bad. But by then there was built some trust. So David Thompson did the area around Brockville, and the Americans did the area around Wellesley Island. They had the easy job, around Wellesley Island. At the beginning of the survey, the line was drawn down the middle of the river. So a man by the name of William Byrd did most of the work around Wellesley Island. And we really find that from his correspondence, we can see that they respected each other, although Delafield often criticized Thompson's work for his inaccuracies. The survey of the Thousand Islands was completed by the end of September, and the survey teams disbanded for the winter, making plans to resume work in the spring. And 3 years later, in June of 1822, the Boundary Commission signed their agreement, and the islands became officially Canadian or American. Now, the problem was that they realized that if they went through an island, they drew the line through, they'd have to have a border on that island. So they decided that it had to be either all Canadian or all American. And it was quite easy. If it was more on the American side, it became an American island. If it was more on the Canadian side, it became an air. And that's why the islands zig and zag around the Lake Fleet. So if you're a sailor, you would recognize that. The Alnwick Band of the Mississaugas is actually a band that is up on the Rice Lake. It's on the south side of the Rice Lake, a place called Aldersville. And at that time, right after the War of 1812 and during the War of 1812, there were a number of Indigenous that were in Kingston. They weren't well organized. They were not well dressed. They had a hard time. It would be very much like we would call the homeless. So there was a group of Mississauga missionaries. I'm getting out of the view of the camera here. Mississauga missionaries who came up from the United States and banded these groups together. And they went and they rented an island out on Grape Island out in the Weller's Bay, which is just past Belleville. And what they did was they rented an island, and they had 200 of them lived on that island. They taught them how to read and write and dress. And they actually, by the time around 1830s, they started to be giving reservations out to different bands across Canada. And the group in Weller's Bay, and they wanted to have a reservation. So they made an appointment with Bishop Strawn right here in Kingston, and they came down, and we have Peter Sunday's chap in the bottom. We have his diary. And from that, we can find that when he came down to Kingston that day, they kept him waiting hours. And finally, they brought him in, and the two chaps in, and he said, Bishop Strawn said, you know, you should have your own reservation. Others have it, you should have one. So what we're going to do is we're going to give you one, but I'm afraid you're going to have to stop being, have the Methodist priests in your domain. You're going to have to come back to the Church of England. Yeah. So they said, okay. And they went back and they got everybody together and they had a discussion and they agreed, no, we're not going to do that. So they didn't. And they didn't get a reservation for another maybe 5 or 6 years, but they finally did get it. And they signed a treaty, and it's treaty number 77. And it was signed in 1856. So it was a long time after they'd had their reservation. And what did I do with my book here? I had it here. Oh, there we are. Safeguarding, I think. And I would like to read you just a little bit of the surrender, number 77. Know all men, by those present, that we, the undersigned, John Sunday, John Simpson, Jacob Sunday, John Pynchon, Joseph Skunk, Thomas Fraser, and James Indian, chiefs and principal members of this portion of the Mississaugas tribe of the Indians, formerly living on Grape Island in the Lake Ontario, but now settled and residing in the township of Alnwick, goes on, the tribes of Indians to which we belong and form a part for the consideration hereafter mentioned and stipulated, do hereby freely, fully, and voluntarily surrender, convey, and forever quit claim our most gracious sovereign lady Queen Victoria and her successors in trust to be sold or otherwise disposed of, and that the best advantage for ourselves and for our descendants. So it goes on. So what they were doing is they would sell the islands, and it became the Department of Indian and Northern Affairs. They could sell the islands, but the money would be put in trust for the band, and the band would receive income from that trust forever after. And that is what happened. But it took a little while to do. That was Weller's Bay, which you can see, which is right down, yeah, right there. And Aldersville is right above it, way up there. And then here are the islands down here. All right, now we can go to the next. Okay, and it was fishing that brought people to the Thousand Islands. And it was after the American Civil War in the late 1860s that U.S. industrialists suddenly found that they had free time and resources to go on holiday. George Pullman, who created the Great Pullman Railroad Empire, is credited with bringing tourists to the islands. And in 1872, he invited Vice President Ulysses S. Grant to visit Pullman Island opposite Alexandria Bay. He invited the press, always traveled with the president, of course. And so Grant was running for a second term as president. And when he traveled, the press came with him. Several boats were engaged to take the pressmen out on the river. And they all went back to their respective cities and wrote about the beauty of the river and the islands. And this is one of my favorite slides, the next one. Okay, here we go. This is the Crossman House was built on the waterfront in Alexandria Bay. And this is a photograph of the veranda looking out over the islands. Now you can just imagine, okay, the lady on the right never stops talking about her New York home, her successful children, and her wealth, while the lady on the left is trying to get a word in edgewise. And when she does, it's all about her life. So the poor old lady in the middle has had it. Her husband, like all the other men, would spend the day out on the river fishing and being rowed in their St. Lawrence skiffs by guides. And when he came home, she said, "Darling, if I have to sit one more day on that veranda, I'm simply going to die." So he would encourage her to go out on the tour boats that were plying the river and pick out an island that he would like, or they would like. And they would build a home. And before long, many of the islands close to the U.S. settlement of A Bay and Clayton, New York, were sold, and homes, including castles, were constructed. Now, one day I was in the Jefferson County Historical Society and looking at a small box of Thousand Islands material. It was a small notebook that I found, and all the information was written in pencil. The first part of the book had recorded sales of glass. Wait a minute. That means that it belonged to Charles Cornwall. And the reason I knew this was that Charles Cornwall was one of the secession of the American islands goes this way, that way, this way, that way. And finally, Charles Cornwall got hold of most of them. Nobody really wanted islands because there wasn't much you could do with them. Some of the islands were cut down for timber, but mostly they weren't. So until these homes and people wanted to start building them, they weren't very important. So Charles Cornwall owned all the islands. And the last part of the book, he had a job, a real job, and that was selling glass. So as soon as I saw that there were glass sales in there, I knew it was Charles Cornwall's book. And not only that, when you looked in the back of the book, you saw all these islands, and it would be a name of an island, and it'd say $50 beside it, or $25. So I then went to the actual registry office in Watertown, and I looked them up, and they all matched. So I realized that was the recording of the very first sales of the islands, and the American islands were definitely sold first. So, okay, now we're going to go on. But what about the Canadian islands? As agreed to the surrender of 77, the lands were considered owned by the Mississauga. The Department of Indian and Northern Affairs were given a list of 14 islands. So in 1873, almost 2 years after the surrender, the government hired another surveyor, Charles Unwin from Toronto. He and his surveyors went on the first out in the ice, and then when the ice melted, they had their boats, and they literally surveyed all the islands from the west of Gananoque downriver to Brockville. For the most part, they kept the names that Owen had designated, but if the island was known by a local name, then they gave it twice. So up in our area, we will have Bostwick and York, or we'll have Hay and Melville. By now, some of the smaller islands were valuable and they could be sold. So they were given a number. And around our island, we have island 1, 2, 3, 6, right up to island 18. And the numbers grew until they reached Brockville, where there's 122 islands in all. So, but few islands were sold. Only those that were in close proximity to the mainland. You know what? They didn't have poker boats in those days. They didn't even have outdoor motors. So by 1894, 20 years later, there was so much interest that the department decided to do another survey. And they did, and they hired Walter Beatty, who actually came from Lansdowne. He decided that he would do the survey, he would keep the names and he would keep the numbers, but all the tiny islands that suddenly looked important, he gave them letters. So suddenly we have island 1, 1A, 1B. I can't remember, but I think the highest letter would go up to a J. Tiny islands. Years later, the department offered the islands to the towns along the river. And believe it or not, the only town that took it up was Brockville, and they own 22 islands. The trail of sales for the U.S. islands, we'll go one more. Those were the actual books that were printed and distributed. And a lot of the islands were sold to a guy by the name of Morris. It stipulated that on the Canadian islands that you could only buy one island unless the other island was very close in proximity. So you could buy 1 and 1A, but you couldn't buy 1A and island 8 down there. And that was smart. They didn't want it to be something where they were going to, buy islands and then just try to make money. Of course, that doesn't always work, right? And a man by the name of Morris, he was actually the mayor of Ottawa, and he came and he bought a lot of islands. So many of the islands around Ivy Lee, Huckleberry, and all of those islands, they were all bought by people. A lady who might live in Scotland, another lady who also lived in Scotland, a man that lived in Scotland. They were all his relatives, and he got them all to petition and buy an island. Problem was, the economy wasn't really great at that time, and some of those islands, it took many, many years before they were sold. So he really didn't make very much. All right. And now, many of the sales on the U.S. island and the survey maps is another story altogether. Suffice to say that the U.S. islands are mostly larger in size and therefore considered whole communities. The history of the Thousand Islands Park and Westminster Park, 2 religious camps on Wellesley Island, are absolutely fascinating. Then for the past 10 years, we've been fortunate to have Manly Rushell spent the many years, that's all the last years of his life, writing his memories for my Thousand Islands Life magazine. And if I've not put you to sleep, maybe you'll invite me back sometime and I can tell you all about the magazine. I'm going to conclude. Now I conclude with some historical information you may not have heard, nor perhaps you might even care about. But one year I was asked to lead a week-long elder hostel study group in Gananoque. On the 2nd or 3rd day, there was one man who didn't seem to know anybody, and he was not really being included. So at lunchtime, I went up and I introduced myself and I started to ask questions. And I found out that he was from Hollywood and he was in the film industry. He asked if I'd heard of May Irwin. I said, yes, of course I have. But she was a great vaudeville actress. She was actually born in Canada, she and her sister. But she became the talk of the town, absolute talk of the town. And there she is on the at the train with all her entourage. I mean, she really was a remarkable lady. When you talk about Thousand Island dressing, she's always part of that story too. But I said I had, but he quickly told me that I should. And he said she was the first actress to kiss on screen in 1896, around 18 seconds long. So May Irwin, and his name was John Rice. So the final scene of the stage musical of Willow Jones. So my friends, if you want to know where the blue movie started, pornographic, you can tell your friends right there in the Thousand Islands. And now I'll be happy to take any questions. it became there are two stories, I think. It became American, of course, when the borderline was put in, 1822. But it was also one of the islands that they bartered because of the islands up in Niagara and down in Cornwall. So that was part of all of that too. So it's kind of fun. Good question.
Susie, you mentioned David Thompson on the
Mhm.
Canadian surveyor. Is that by any chance the same David Thompson that also went to the Pacific Ocean?
Absolutely.
Yep.
The very same one. In
Wow.
fact, his family actually was Williamstown, Ontario, above Cornwall. That was where he ended up. Yeah, no, it was exactly the
Okay.
same person. And that's why the stamps all have you can get stamps with his name on it. I mean, truly, I don't think any of the surveyors ever got their due other than David Thompson. When you drive in the backcountry and you're driving along a road and then all of a sudden you do a little left turn and then you go again. That was a surveyor that did that, and they did it for reasons. They did it. That is exactly how the line should go. It shouldn't just go straight. Somebody was saying today, there's somebody that lives south of us, a president, and he said, oh, all they did was take a pencil line and just draw it across. They didn't. And those people who really worked hard over those years, I think did a fantastic job. You can imagine going, and their Boundary Island out in the Lake Fleet, they have the brass markings for the boundaries, the commission that went through there in 1818, 1822. Well, it was a bit before 1822. So yeah, they worked very hard for us.
Mhm.
Well, any of you who have done research, Paul, do it. Sorry, I have to do this. Any of you who have done research know what it's like. You get a little nugget and you want to learn a little more. And maybe I can find it here. Maybe I can find it there. And there are a lot of dead ends, but boy, when you find it, I call them gold, absolute gold. It's really, really fun. And it leads you on to something else and something else. And yeah, my poor husband had to put up, my first husband had to put up with an awful lot because he was alive when I did the book. And the second husband has put up 20 years I've done the TI Life, or 18 years I've done TI Life. And he's put up with that. Yeah, we're really lucky. We have 22. There are 22 in the national park system here. It was the first park, and it was the tiniest park, and has remained one of the tiniest parks. And there was a time in 1976 when they talked about expropriating all the islands and making it all one big park. No, anyway, a lot of people fought it. And some fought it right here in this room, and we won. Well, we lost one this week. The man who owned Zavicon Island, his wife wrote to me today. Zavicon Island is the one that has the tiniest international bridge. It isn't really. They're both actually Canadian, but we won't tell that to the tour guides. This year, the one thing about building the houses, which I found interesting until we built our house, was that many of the islands are right down by the water. They're right, you can't miss them. And I said that one time to our builder, and he said, yeah, but Susie, don't you realize that, it doesn't take as much energy to bring the logs and to bring the wood and the glass and the dishwasher and the fridge from there to here than it does to go from here way up there. And so that's fun. But some of them, the one on Niagara Island, which is built in the 1920s. It looks like it was built 3 years ago. And its designer, he actually lived out on another island, and the architect. So yeah, we're really, really fortunate. And at Queen's, they did a wonderful study of much of the architecture of the Thousand Islands, and you can find that book. It's called Wilderness, AU Wilderness, and that's a wonderful book talking about the architecture of the Thousand Islands. So,
Susan,
anyway.
is there perhaps an unwritten history of the Thousand Islands? The President of the United States now seems to be convinced that we Canadians are smuggling fentanyl across the border. I know from writing about mid-19th century Ontario economy that smuggling, particularly across the St. Lawrence, was a year-round activity.
It was. There's a place called Horseshoe Bay down in Ivy Lee area. Yeah, they smuggled horses. They smuggled a lot of well, it wasn't so much smuggling. Io Eden Island is in the Lake Fleet. And Io Eden, I went to visit them one time, and I had a wonderful visit. A lady by the name of Judy Pearson, and she showed me the gift book, and the gift book said, the guest book, it said, "When I have a better time, I will be in heaven." Well, it was just across the American border, and we could drink, and those guys couldn't. So they all came over. There's another island, just another house just near in the Navy fleet, and they have a big banker's vault there. You can imagine what was in there. I know that we lived on our island for 4 years in the winter, and in the spring breakup and in the fall freezing, the boats would go in and out of Half Moon Bay. And, I don't think they were going there for the religious services, but, and I do think that was drug smuggling, definitely. But the Prohibition era was just tremendous.
I'm always struck when we go to the islands or go to Clayton or go to Brockville, that the proximity of people summering there now has created a kind of wonderful bi-national sense of identity. You worked in Clayton, defending that side of the river. In these hard times we're in now, the islands provide us with a model of how we should get along with the Americans. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. In fact, we did an article in TI Life. We called it Spirit of the River. And we asked people to fill out a survey to see, what over the years have you done or has happened to you that shows the spirit of the river. And one of the stories was by a doctor, Dick Withington. Dick Withington lives on Round Island. He's an orthopedic surgeon, but he's a doctor who he works with the Clayton fireboat. And anytime the Clayton fireboat is called out, he goes out to help them. So one day he got called, and the Clayton Fire Department said, "Look, Dick, we have a problem. We have an American on a Canadian island, and we think he's had a heart attack. And he really needs to come back to Canada because he can't afford to go to an out-of-country hospital." So Dick said, "Well, let me see what I can do." So Dick went over. I don't think he checked into customs. I haven't asked him that, but that's just between us and you and me, right? Everybody. But anyway, he went over, he saw the man, definitely had a heart attack. He put him in the boat, and he called the Clayton Fire Department, and he said, "Okay, I'm going to be right here, and I want you to come up beside me, and we'll transfer the patient, and then you take him to the hospital." And that's exactly what happened. And the man was just overwhelmed. We've had many, many times when people have broken down in front of their islands. What are you going to do? You're either going to have them there for the rest of the summer, or you're going to help them take them home. So, yeah. And I think it's like anything. I'm really lucky. My daughter and her husband live in Clayton. They moved up from New England, and they wanted to live in the river, and they hated the 7-hour trip. I mean, anybody else like that? Do your kids hate to come and visit you because it's so far away? So they moved, and he has his own construction company now. And he just says that how lucky they are that they're here. But I'm thinking about those people in the War of 1812. They have people on both sides of the river. We have so many families that over the years have been intermarried with people on the other side of the river. I mean, if you were a teenager in Canada, you always went to drink in A Bay. And I bet you there were a lot of people that fell in love in those bars in A Bay. So, yeah, it's very hard. It is hard.
Reminds me of a plaque we have on the wall of our place up at Rideau Lakes. If you're lucky enough to live by water, you're
lucky enough. Absolutely. Thank you
Susan,
very much.
thank you very much for
I hope I wasn't too long.
Thank you on behalf of the society. I hope you will keep us posted. And I would urge all of you, if you haven't, to go home, get on the your search engine and go to the Thousand Islands Life and sample this lovely, lovely magazine. The visuals, the writing of wonderful quality, and much of it is due to our speaker here tonight. So thank you very much, Susan.
Yeah. Okay. So just finally, thank you again, Susan, on behalf of the society. I don't know if we can beat this crowd here tonight. It's wonderful, but I hope, because next month we have probably our farthest traveling speaker this year, all the way from the fifth floor, is it? Seventh. Oh, the seventh floor. Goodness, there you go, going up in the world. Paul is speaking on a very a topic very much close to his heart, the experience of his cousin in the Second World War, who was a tail gunner in an RCAF bomber, didn't survive the war. But Paul will look at his story through letters and through family remembrances and everything. So we welcome you back then, and thank you for coming tonight. That's October the 15th. That's right. So enjoy yourselves until then. Look forward to seeing you on the 15th.